Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. Got a lot to talk about this week. We there's seldom a shortage of stuff to talk about, but this is definitely one of those weeks where we can only come up with like a subset, at least in our sort of planning stages for for what we're going to discuss in a given episode of the podcast. Let me just start by saying I think we're going to kick off talking about the situation in New York City. Now, TPM is based in New York City. We may have a sort of inherently slightly myopic view of it. Kate is based in Washington, D.C. I'm in New York City. But I think this is a case where this is not just a matter of making a big deal about about the local situation. The corruption case against Mayor Adams, it's been on the national radar because it's New York City and it's kind of a florid corruption story in the sense that you we know that foreign countries like to involve themselves in U.S. politics. There's a reason why foreign nationals can't contribute to U.S. presidential campaigns. One of the many weird things about the Adams story is that the government of Turkey was basically trying to, I don't know, uh, get a leg in with the mayor of New York City, which there's a lot of things that Turkey has longstanding interests in. You wouldn't think of like New York City being a top one, right? Doesn't have anything to do with Greece or the Armenians or the larger Middle East or anything like this. Um, and a lot of what they were looking to Adams about, I mean, not surprisingly, given uh, the history of the Turkish Republic in the last century. Kind of go easy on the Armenian stuff, Eric. Right? Kind of that's always going to be in the mix. But a lot of it was like, hey, we have some like uh, zoning issues. In any case, it's a weird kind of story. But to the extent, but at a basic level, it's kind of garden variety corruption. But it became a much bigger deal when President Trump uh, decided to use it to basically try to take control of the city of New York. Now, New York City has obviously always bulked large for Donald Trump. In some ways, Trump's villain origin story is tied to being a big deal in New York City, but never given respect by the people who he wanted to respect him in New York City. But today, the real thing is that New York City remains far and away the biggest city in the United States. There are other big metro areas that are at least in the ballpark, but the city itself is way bigger. The actual literal boundaries of the city of New York, the population of New York, super big. Immigration is his big thing, and he wants ICE to have free reign in New York City. He wants ICE to have free reign everywhere, but obviously there's something about New York specifically nation's biggest city, where most or many press organizations are located, and he wants, and it's his hometown, erstwhile hometown, but his hometown, and this case gave him that opening. And you know about the details. He's trying to cut a deal with Eric Adams, and there's been a push in New York City for some time, New York City and New York State, because the governor has this, luckily seldom used ability to remove the mayor, that she should do so. And things changed pretty dramatically when they cut this deal, because the deal is corrupt in a kind of a technical way, but the residents of the city of New York are entitled to an elective mayor. They elect someone, that person is their own person, they're not under the control of someone else. And when he did this, Donald Trump basically became the mayor of New York, and that is a big, big deal. So we're going to get into that. We're going to get into a few other issues, of the 20 million that are going on right now. So, Kate, what do you, from the distance of Washington D.C., what are you making of the New York situation?
So, just to give listeners a little outline in case they haven't been following too closely, basically, you had this alleged quid pro quo where Emile Bove for Trump was saying, you, Eric Adams, don't get in the way of his policy or his politics, don't get in the way of the immigration, quote unquote, mass deportations in particular. And for now, temporarily for 10 months, we're, going to drop the case against what seems like pretty open and shut, bribery. And then we shall revisit the topic shortly before the election. So just a really explicit, we've got you on a string, puppet, and you shall dance for us. And over the next 10 months, based on how well you dance, we will make a decision as to whether you will live out your life as a free man or not. And in the reporting around this conversation, we know that, one of the kind of prosecutor deputy types was taking notes, was scolded, had those notes confiscated. And a lot of this came to light too when Danielle Sassoon, this, you know, prosecutor, comes from conservative worlds, right? A Federalist Society type, a post Scalia judge, laid all this out in a letter and said, and resigned in disgust, I say, I'm not going to do this kind of thing. And that set off a whole bunch of resignations from a whole bunch of other career prosecutors who said, yeah, I'm not affixing my name to this. And then, you kind of had a career prosecutor seem to take the bullet for everybody else, say like, okay, I'll do it. Not seemingly not because of enthusiasm, but to kind of
Right.
spare everybody else.
He was at the end of his career, and he could sort of do it in a halfway way, and
Right.
else would have to resign, etc.
So now, where we've been for the past few days, the calls for Hochul to use this weird gubernatorial power to boot him have been amplifying, and you're starting to get it from, more and more significant caliber of people. Her lieutenant governor basically outflanked her and called for Adams to resign. And then you had, the state Senate president, and you're just getting more and more serious people saying that he's got to go. And now there's some kind of internecine debate about, should she just do it? Should they set up this commission that you can form in the light of mayoral incompetence, which seems to be kind of 25th Amendment-y, there in case he loses his marbles, and then you kind of
Yeah.
get subsidiary leaders from different parts of the city to be on a council together. So there's some, should she do this? Should she do that? Should she do it at all? And she's kind of in this, I think she's handling this really terribly, to be clear, but I do think she's in a politically tricky position because what she's trying to, walk the tightrope here is she doesn't want to piss off Black people, especially Black leaders. She's like very conspicuously kind of courting the opinions of like Al Sharpton and Meeks and these various leaders within the community. She clearly wants cover from them,
Yep.
if she
Yep.
ends up booting him. Um, she also has, if she does this, if she takes out Adams, the likeliest candidate to take his place is Cuomo, who's at the moment kind of staging a comeback and who has historically sort of shared a base with Adams. So by knocking him off the chessboard, she makes it way easier for him to become mayor. And the two of them and their staffs have a pretty famously hostile relationship versus her relationship with Adams, which she very conspicuously touted as close and friendly, and they collaborated on public safety and, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, she has her own political baggage. She's like really unpopular, and to the point that some people in New York are really questioning whether she can run in 2026, like if she even has the kind of political life to do it. So, as a result of all this, though, what I think she's doing that's bad is, I'm not dismissing the idea that you should be thoughtful before you like boot an official who was elected. Um, but the wishy-washiness is, it just feels to me like the worst of all worlds, you know? It's like you gotta pick something and do it because I get the democracy thing, but then you've got, I mean, he's so clearly compromised, that's gotta be kind of the exception, of the rule, and then you've got, they're doing this weird thing where they're creating kind of like fake, we have to wait and see X before we act. And the current one is, we're recording this Wednesday around 1 p.m. Dale Ho, the judge in this case, is going to have a hearing over the DOJ's dismissal claims. And there are some like weird workaround things you can do in these situations where the prosecution is basically like corrupt and trying to drop a case corruptly, where the judge can basically assign like a third party to kind of like come in and take over the prosecution. So you get the sense that maybe Hochul is waiting to see if the judge is going to kind of bail her out of making this decision. But it feels like after that hearing happens, and the likeliest outcome here is that the judge lets the prosecution drop the case, because the other options are just so much more like fantasy court, it just is so rare.
Well, I think one thing they can do is, and this is irrelevant but kind of weird. The earlier iteration of this podcast, or maybe it was a briefing. I actually did a briefing with Judge Ho. This was when he was, I believe he was like part of, at the ACLU they have different litigation groups,
Mhm.
right? And he was the head of one of those. Maybe it was voting rights. So kind of brush with greatness kind of thing. I think an additional thing he can do is he can say, okay, I'm not going to make a decision yet, with the idea that he will eventually let them do it, because as you say, that's a big step, right? The judge, it's kind of not the judge's place to say you can't end a prosecution or something like that. But what he can do, I think, is appoint a special master, just to say like, okay, there's sounds like some weird stuff went on here, so I'm not taking over, but I'd like to just clarify what happened. And obviously in the context that has, a lot of possibilities, a lot of bad stuff could come out of that, to the extent that things are verified about what was said or what happened to the notes, or so all those things are possible as well.
So, I mean, that's where we are now. It feels like gotta have to make a decision by the end of the week, unless
I
something
feel
weird happens in court.
Yeah, I feel there was a statement she put out. I don't know, like I mean, there's the official committee that is in the New York City charter, which I think they call it the Inabilities Committee, kind of a poorly branded committee, right?
Hilarious.
But it's, as Kate said, it's like, the most senior of the borough presidents, and this person and that person, kind of, a sort of a committee of bigwigs to do a 25th Amendment on the mayor, the mayor of New York. But Hochul actually put out a statement a couple days ago where she said she's meeting. This is, I think, what you were referring to, where kind of major stakeholders in the Black community in New York, because she clearly needs that cover. Um, but she said that in a way that it struck me that would is going to be hard for her to come back from. That she basically said, "I would never think of, displacing an elective mayor, but when such and such has happened and such and the other has happened and all this has happened, clearly it falls to me to make this very important decision. So I'm going to sit down with Reverend Sharpton and sit down with these people and whatever." It's hard for me to imagine you come out of that and say, "We sat down. It seems like it's all good. So we're moving along." I mean, it seems like she was pretty clearly queuing herself up to take this state. And just one other point for, again, people who are not from New York and don't have a feeling for all the politics. Hochul is not only uh, unpopular, she's very much an accidental governor. She was the, kind of lieutenant governor who got it because the Cuomo family is from Queens. They get someone from upstate. She was the lieutenant governor when he had his whole scandal with, sexual harassment slash COVID scandal that led to his resignation. So she's never really been someone who has any kind of real base in the state. She became governor and then she run again, but again, it's a Democratic state. So no one, she had a kind of a glide path. So that is an important background to all this. The fact that she has very little legs to stand on independently in this state to start with.
And fair or not, and you want to include she's a woman in an executive role, and that inflects the kind of coverage and reaction always. But I think primarily too because of the congestion pricing debacle, she has become known as pretty wishy-washy. And for listeners who have forgotten, because it feels like 10 years ago, that was a whole thing where they were going to start the congestion pricing process. And then there was some kind of revolt from House Democrats in New York who thought that it would doom their electoral chances. So then she kind of delayed it, X number of months. And it pissed people off who were really eager for that reform to be put in place, and for everyone else, she just kind of looked, weak and politician-y and,
And she did let it go forward
yeah,
in a reduced way, so she kind of pissed everybody off.
exactly. Of course, now, a story broke just before we headed in here that Trump's DOT is gonna try to stop congestion pricing, repeal it. I'm not quite sure what business it is of theirs, but
It is weird because I think just it, and this is only relevant because there's other cities with traffic. I do think the general impression is, I mean, obviously some people are still terribly against it because they're commuters and everything, but the general sense is that it's been really successful.
yeah.
And I live in the congestion pricing place, so in a sense it kind of hits me because I go out of the city fairly often, but you can see the difference on the streets. The number of pedestrians being run over has gone down pretty significantly, and there's just less traffic. So it's a whole other, but it's a classic Trump thing because it's the commuters, it's the suburban
Well,
commuters who want to get rid of it.
right, and I mean, it's funny, this is something I've followed pretty closely in my just personal capacity because 'cause I'm interested in urbanism and transit stuff, and, you've kind of got it. The positive reactions have been coming from both sides to some degree, a little bit from people who don't drive, right? Because it's
Hmm.
become less of a hellscape. And then,
Yep. Yep.
you've got a lot of accounts from like truck drivers and professional drivers who are like, my commute was cut by 45 minutes. So it is one of those things where, especially because, I spend a lot of time in these kind of transit oriented communities where it's takes so much work to get any reform to pass ever, and this has been like the one bright shining star for these people who also tend to be aligned against Trump, and it's just so classic that he's kind of swooping in. And this is neither here nor there, but in terms of, I'll be interested to find out what happens with this kind of come down from above, you must shut off your program order, because you've got supremacy for sure, but like states generally get to decide some of their own stuff. And then you have the additional wrinkle of like, I don't know exactly how federally funded highways play into this. So, a whole mess, but it does tie into how you opened this with the whole like New York is such an object of fascination in Trump's psyche that, like, that if, I don't know, Iowa had put in to place a congestion pricing
Right, right, right.
scheme, he wouldn't give a fuck. But because it's New
Yeah.
York, he's like, well, that's my terrain. Time to take it back.
Well, it's even, an addition. I hadn't thought about it quite in this light, but just for those who are not living in New York City, basically what it does, it creates basically the lower half of Manhattan. Technically, it's a little less than the lower half, where you cut the half. I believe it's below 60th Street, basically below Central Park. Everything within there to transit in and out of there. It's pretty steep. I believe it's nine. It's not each way. If you go, I think it's when you go in, you pay it. But basically, to go in and out of New York costs $9 in it, over the fact that there's already tolls on the various bridges and blah 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 blah. So it is not just you know cutting through the metro area. It's also within the city. It's even within Manhattan in many cases, and it's not no money. And certainly, if you're, I mean, the idea of that someone would commute by car into the city. The traffic is so unbelievably hellish. I don't know why anybody would do that, frankly. Even if you had the money to pay all the tolls and have a driver, it's just it's absolutely hellish. But it does, the funny thing about Trump is, he's a guy from Queens who never thought the sort of the fancy people in Manhattan gave him his due, right? So it is very much a revolt of, to the extent there was a revolt, and as Kate said, there's, I, by and large, even the enemies have been more favorable towards it than they expected to be. But it's very much a kind of a revolt of Queens and Westchester against Manhattan. So how could Trump, resist in some ways?
Right. So, we're watching that. It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting in general, but I think our, like, news focus is most staked on the attempt to totally take over SDNY, right? And this
Right.
has
Yeah.
been a bugaboo for Republicans, but Trump specifically, in a really intense way, which is, that is the office that is renowned, right? It has this big reputation. It's, like, known for being independent and hard hitting. And I mean, particularly during the Trump administration, it was the source of a ton of his kind of political or his legal woes. So this is definitely about getting Eric Adams to dance. And I'm sure the Trump administration, we know that they want to go after blue cities, right? I mean, that's the bastion of the resistance right now, and absolutely ground zero in terms of Democrats kind of rebuilding their reputation and scouting for who's going to be next up to bat. So that's all very much in the mix. And also, I think on the psychological end, Trump wants to go after blue cities, right? Like, he hates people who didn't vote for him and he wants to immiserate them. But you also have the bringing the SDNY under heel piece of this as well. And I think those things are kind of running concurrently.
I think one other additional point to make about this whole meta story, and to zoom back out, a lot of the stuff that we were just talking about is kind of, these are parochial New York City issues. But the SDNY thing and the conjoined matter of the president basically taking control of a city in this very corrupt, very indirect way. Those are national issues. That's not like, oh, is there too much traffic below Central Park, which is obviously, who gives a crap if you live anywhere else but this city. Another point that is worth making here, though, is that generally speaking, in stories like this, to the extent we can say that, when we say we know this happened, we know that happened, it's because of reporting. We have news organizations that have talked to a lot of people, and based on their reputation, they have said X happened and we believe that X happened. This is a little different in that the acting US attorney, who is really Federalist Society royalty. I have some people who I have a lot of people I know in that kind of general New York power lawyers on both sides of the aisle. And this woman's career plan, as I understand it, was she's going to be acting. She's 38 years old. She's going to be acting U.S. attorney in New York for a month or two, and then she's going to kind of wait for her appointment to a judgeship. Right? That's her career plan. That's her life. That's her life thing. In this case, she wrote a letter. Now it's a letter to the AG, so it's not a filing. It's not technically under pain of of perjury or whatever. But she said very clearly that Emile Beauvais did these things. So this isn't sort of like, oh, reporting says. The actual U.S. attorney wrote a letter. The letter is public, in which she said they did a quid pro quo right in front of me. They told my assistant to stop taking notes. Then they confiscated the notes. I mean, this is shocking on the just on its own. But the fact that you have someone put in their own name publicly, I watched this happen. Something I was thinking about a couple days ago was, and I'd be curious. We have many lawyers who and people involved in criminal law. I'm curious what you think of this. It seems to me that other than the fact that the president told him to do it, what Beauvais did here would, in other circumstances, I believe this isn't just unethical. I think this probably violates a number of criminal laws. The idea that you would make a explicit bargain, you do these policy things for me, and I will make your criminal prosecution go away. I mean, again, imagine this is a scenario where Beauvais is doing this on his own. That's not just like an ethical violation. I'm pretty sure there's lots of laws that say you can't do this. The whole thing is pretty shocking, and that's why, to go back to the point we were discussing a little while ago, I believe that Dale Ho, everybody I talk to says there's really no, in theory, he could refuse, but it's just not the place of the judge. But he can do this special master thing, which would basically be him saying, I'm pretty troubled by what um, Daniel Sassoon said in this letter. So, in the interest of justice, I'm appointing this special master who's going to find out what happened and come back to me, just in the interests of justice or whatever. And that would be that would open a pretty dramatic new storyline in and of itself.
So we're going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about Elon Musk. I can hear like a communal groan from our listeners, but I want to talk less about what he's doing right now, which is kind of continuing the rampage through the government, and talk about the politics of Musk a little bit, because this has been a debate that is becoming kind of louder on the left, which is, what do you do with Elon Musk, right? And I think the conventional wisdom at the beginning of the term was he fits into the eat the rich paradigm, right? Like, he is the billionaire who is rummaging through your social security numbers, right? He's kind of an easy antagonist. And this is how Democrats have responded. But it brings up the secondary question of, okay, what do you do about Trump then? If you're spending all your time kind of attacking Musk, Trump gets off scot-free. And I mean, to some degree, that is reflected in these admittedly early favorability ratings, where Trump is still, at or above 50%, which is low for a new president, but very high for him. And then you've got Musk is kind of dropping every time it's polled, and more people kind of get to know him. So it, this is what I think is like the heat shield theory, right? That Musk is out there in front of him, absorbing all the criticism, and Trump gets to kind of go on in popularity, which, as we discussed last episode, is really important to his effectiveness. And then you're left with this quandary, because I think the Musk attacks, at least at the beginning, were pretty novel too. So it gave Democrats a bigger bite at the attention landscape, because, I mean, he is such a troll that he attracts attention with everything he does. Versus, you could argue, well, isn't Trump the OG troll? Yeah, but Democrats have been attacking him for a decade now, right? Like, that's old news kind of thing. So And then in the background of all this, you've got Trump's just stunning obsequiousness, with the likes of which we have truly never seen from him before. You know, when they had this Oval Office meeting where Musk is there with one of his prop children running around, and Trump just out there silently, like acquiescently let Musk kind of field all these questions. And then last night, I think it was last night,
On Fox. Yeah, it was
he
last
went
night.
on this Fox News interview, and who does he bring? Not his VP, not the first lady. He brings Musk, right? And then there's a Time magazine cover that has Musk sitting by himself behind the Resolute desk, and it's just that piece of it, I have to say, surprises me, because you can make all the arguments in the world why Trump needs Musk and is benefiting off this partnership, and it would be potentially really damaging for him to like get in a falling out. That has never stopped Trump before, you know? Like, you can bring up all the points why it's kind of savvy and politically wise, and then you come back to the point of like, well, yeah, but it's Trump. So, a man who's just entirely guided by his id, you know? But
Right,
that's where we are
right.
right now. Like, they seem totally kumbaya, totally symbiotic.
Yeah, I partially agree with that. I think they are totally symbiotic in the sense that I don't think Trump sees an off ramp, and I think that he enjoys the pain. He enjoys seeing Musk hurt people. But Musk is unlike anybody else he has ever dealt with before, in as much as he also has his own cult. He has an amount of money that all the things we know about, right? He is not someone who Trump can just show up on Twitter. I mean, ironically, that's a whole other part of this, but show up on Twitter one day and says, "Thank you very much for your service, Elon Musk." He's being replaced by who Don Jr. or something like
Right.
that, because you know uh he can fund any race. He can go on Twitter, and I don't think Elon Musk is the type who's going to go, "Oh man, oh bummer." No, of course not, right? So I don't think, and I think we do see um plenty of, maybe not in that thing last night, but plenty of times where you can kind of see that Trump isn't crazy about being sidelined. It
Lately,
it
though, that felt like to
I
me that it was happening at the beginning, and now Trump is
y
kind of back in line.
po You might be right, you might be right. I mean, I need to watch that interview last night a little more closely. If we're talking about, maybe a shift in the last 3 or 4 days, maybe. Um, but in my mind, at least, he doesn't have much choice, right? So, and showing his irkness is a uh showing his irkedness is very damaging in itself. It's if to the extent he's irked, he is advertising that he can't control the situation. On this question of, should is Elon Musk becoming a heat shield for Trump? Are they going on, would they be going after the shiny object of Musk when when the game is really all about Trump? I think this is a case, you don't know, you can't overthink things. He is the guy right now. As you said, his stuff breaks through. People see his stuff, right? Um, you go after him because he is the one who Trump has empowered, and everybody knows that. It's happening on Trump's watch. Um, and I guess, to me, it's not even like it's not even like I can't think of an alternative analogy, but the real hit, even if Elon Musk had never come into this story, right? The real message against Trump is that he's basically giving away everything to the billionaires and taking it from you. And he's doing this, kind of throwing a lot of shiny objects around and stuff like that, and creating a lot of chaos. But at the end of the day, the big things are big tax cuts for the billionaires and taking away everything from everybody else. That is not something where you say, "Wow, can't really fit Elon Musk into that, so it's too much channel conflict." It fits perfectly into it. And even in the sense of, I mean, obviously, you have to be a certain kind of person to be really upset about the fact that, like, look, you can abolish USAID, but this is an illegal way to do it. Um, but lots of the stuff is, again, things that fit right into that slipstream. He's going in and he's firing a lot of the people who make sure your social security check arrives on time, or make sure y- that people can't look at your, at stuff with you tied to Medicare or your tax returns and stuff like that. Everything fits together. So you just, again, this is just something not to overthink. Democrats should be talking about Musk nonstop.
I
Musk,
think
Trump.
I think they also just don't have a choice. Like, this is, I mean, as we've discussed, especially post-election, Democrats are not competing at all in the attention economy, and, like, Musk is where the attention is, so you gotta go there, and then I think you're totally right that it also helps in terms of some of Democrats' squishiness about going so hard against Trump this time when they feel like, well, this time was
People like him now.
legitimate.
Yeah,
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 like
yeah,
he
yeah,
won most people. Nobody, chose Elon Musk. Like, I don't think anybody foresaw that his role in Trump's administration would be president, more or less, and that Trump would be his deputy, right? I mean, because none of us thought that Trump would characterologically allow that. But,
yeah,
here we are. Um, so yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think the subsidiary question there is, if you're going after Musk, you're going after him for destroying the federal government, right? And then it's, how do you talk about that? That I think is something Democrats are still like feeling out a little bit, because we've discussed this before, but Democrats do not want to be a party of institutions that people don't like, at least not in their messaging game, right? So
hmm
it
hmm
can't just be he's going after the bureaucrats, right? And so I think you're seeing more Democrats trying to kind of surface the sympathetic stories that are mixed in here. Like, one I saw get a lot of traction is a disabled veteran who has 4 children, who has some like innocuous kind of government type job, who got axed unceremoniously. That's going to happen all the time, because that's what most of these people are, and a ton of them are veterans. So
That was what I was going to say. And people don't know this, and some of that is because there are some jobs that going from the military into certain kind of government jobs is just kind of a natural segue, but also there's preferences. The whole civil service has very explicit preferences for veterans, so it's not accidental, and as you say, disproportionately veterans.
yeah, so I mean, it's also at a place where, did you see this weird thing that the DOJ was like, "No, Musk isn't actually in charge of Doge. He's"
Very much so. Yeah.
yeah,
well,
he's, like a
well they say
contract consultant type thing.
well, basically, and it's funny, when we were talking before, I brought up uh Trump's approval numbers, and they're basically, again, as you said, for Trump, they're still pretty good. He's in on approval. He's still in, net positive territory by, like 3.5 points or something like that. Having said that, from his inauguration, um, to now, which is only like 3 weeks or 3.5 weeks or something like that, maybe 4 weeks, he's already fallen 5 points. You can't, presidents don't at the beginning of their term drop 20 points. That doesn't happen. So to some extent, people uh, uh, have to be patient. The other thing, with on this, lost my train of thought for a second. On this thing about whether he runs Doge, it's this classic thing where, um, Trump Trump salesmanship has run right into the law because basically, um, under the rules, if you have significant delegated authority, you need to be approved by by Congress. You need to be nominated and approved by the Senate. And Trump has been out there. I mean, we've all seen it. He's been out there numerous times saying he is the head of Doge. He's got this. I love it. He's doing all the awesome stuff. And but if that's true, he needs to be confirmed by the Senate. That's open and shut. And so the DOJ was forced into this position. So in fact, he not only is not in charge of Doge, he's not affiliated with Doge. He is an advisor to the president. So all of this, and I know that there was a lot of people were disappointed with Judge Chutkan, who is one of the trial judges in D.C., who a lot of us remember because she was the one who had the D.C. Jack Smith case. She just made a ruling, I believe, possibly yesterday, which basically says, I'm not going to make a blanket ruling now that that Musk has to stop everything. We're going to we're going to get into the details, but I'm not going to do that now. But again, it is the interesting thing about it is that again, it's just such a conflict between what the law is and the sort of the Trump razzmatazz um, world. I mean, let me go back to one other thing you said about, we couldn't have envisaged uh, Musk's role. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people will say, like, oh, what did you expect? Blah, 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 all that kind of, cynicaler than now, kind of doomier than now. I would say it's the whole thing globally is not worse than I expected. Kind of like if Trump's elected, how's it gonna go? But Musk's role is definitely, I did not envision that. That was not on my radar. The sort of the overall tenor of it may be the same. And I think what's key about that is that, and this goes back again to the other kind of political questions we had. It is crystal clear Elon Musk is driving this train. Trump is making the decision to, you know, give it all a thumbs up after the fact. And I think he is enjoying it to the extent that it's making a lot of people cry, basically. But it is unmistakable that he is driving this train, and it is 100% all his people. It's not like, it's not MAGA people. I mean, maybe to the extent now that Elon World and MAGA have been consolidated, but it's 100% Elon people. It is kind of following the Elon rule. So that part really is like, wow, didn't see that coming. You can try to outdoomer me if you want, but I don't think you saw it coming either.
Well, and it presages a clash that you have to think is coming. That part of the symbiosis between Musk and Trump right now is that the people being hurt, by and large, of course not exclusively, but by and large, are federal employees based in DC, right? Who, even in this kind of weird hodgepodge of a Republican Party, all those people can agree they don't like those people. And, you know, whether you're a deep stater or a more kind of old school, I want the executive to be all powerful to kind of carry out my whims, those are people you want cleared out. So all those aims are kind of in alignment. And Musk is a really good person to be heading this because he has so much more energy than Trump does, that he has stayed relatively much more focused than Trump would ever be able to muster. However, at some point, and they keep saying it, and they said it in the interview last night, that they're cutting $1 trillion. If you're cutting that much money, you are going to come up against programs that serve a ton of people. And it's not just, a tiny bit of foreign aid, or it's not just kind of like fucking over people here or there. We're talking SNAP recipients or Medicaid recipients or ACA. That, I mean, we're talking the big money stuff that there's a reason Republicans by and large have been like have been either afraid to touch or thwarted from dismantling up until this point. And that's going to be a really interesting juncture because totally agree with you that Trump likes the pain. He thinks it's funny that he doesn't like these people either, right? But he is not like a Paul Ryan cut the entitlements guy, right? Like he could not care less about that. And he's actually been this kind of like almost moderate figure on it because he so clearly doesn't think that kind of achieving that long time right wing goal is worth the inevitable political backlash of doing that, right? That I mean that's been kind of consistent. And the cuts will keep coming up in like congressional Republican budgets and stuff, and he'll put it in his presidential budget. But every time he's asked about it, you can just tell this isn't something he really cares about, and he is at least savvy enough to recognize the hefty price tag. And at some
That's the let me just say one thing. I mean,
Mhm.
that is the key point. Fundamentally, he doesn't care, and it just makes people not love you. So that's kind of the end of the for him. That's the end of the story.
And what happens then? Like, what happens when if they are truly and there are two theories of the case here, right? Either they actually mean $1 trillion and you're going to touch the sensitive stuff, or they're just going to cut some millions, billions, and say it's $1 trillion, right? They're already kind of like doctoring the math in these different documents. So there's a chance. But if they are, if they mean it and if they're actually going to do it, that's when you would think there would arise some real friction between Musk and Trump because like Musk doesn't care if it's unpopular. What difference does it make to him? This is the benefit of not being elected, right? You don't really have to worry about the will of the masses. But and, to some degree, maybe you could say, well, Trump is a second termer. What does he care? Right. But he does. He does. It's
Mhm.
like the driving force in his life is to be embraced, whether it be the New York glitterati or, the New York Times and the kind of Washington intelligentsia. Like he wants to be considered a good president. And so you would just think that they would butt heads at some point when that arises, when the decisions get a little bit less easy than let's, kind of stop helping like refugees in sub-Saharan Africa or whatever.
Yeah, a lot of this I think is still heavily bound up with the fact of just the speed at which this stuff is happening. Even we've made the point a few times here that foreign aid has never been popular when you poll it. People think it is the country spends wildly more on it than it does. That people think when they guess they about 25% of the budget or something like that. It's basically 1%. Um, Federal workers are also not popular. Now, I want to say really specifically what I mean by that. Um, it is that there is always a generic sense. Oh, I'm sure they could. If we have a deficit, they could just let some people go, and it would there must be the federal government must be doing too much. All these things in generalities. But even something like foreign aid, it's one big thing about foreign aid is it is actually a budget to buy a lot of things in the United States and send them to people, and that that is a fairly significant thing because again, to a great degree, what USAID is sending people food, and those are all budgets that buy what would be either it's basically a price support for U.S. farmers. But it's not technically a price support, but you know, um, in a market sense, it ends up being that. And one of the other things is like what is the Department of Education has a big budget. It does loans. It does. It's one of the big undergirding players in poor urban schools that don't have a lot of money. Department of Education sort of props them up a bit with more funding. But a big thing the Department of Education does is that it supports the very high cost of supporting kids with special needs slash learning disabilities. Everything from 504s and IEPs for kids who have uh, everything from ADHD to severe learning disabilities to kids who are profoundly disabled, right? All of that is all of it. That is a huge amount of that is funded by the Department of Education. And that is one of those things that not everybody has a child with special needs, particularly on in the more where more costly support is necessary. But that isn't something that just to a great extent, um, certainly conservatives look at. Well, I don't care about minority kids in inner cities. That's not my problem. Special needs kids, that's across the whole population. So there are things like that actions are already being taken in Washington that is going to have a severe impact on that, but it hasn't quite registered yet. So they're already making big cuts that people are going to, that people are going to feel. And if you're, I take your point, kind of who knows what they're talking about when they say $1 trillion. I mean, basically, once you take off the statutory responsibilities of Medicare, Social Security, defense, and servicing the national debt, the entire remaining budget isn't that much more than $1 trillion. So you're, and even one thing that I noticed, basically a lot of the national parks are closed now. Like at Yosemite, the system where you do you get a reservation for when you're going to go, or the people who are like cleaning the toilets and stuff, that's all been shut down. So a lot of this stuff, again, it's happened so quickly. It takes, I mean, look at this. It took about a week for this stuff really to get underway. So everything we're talking about here is over a 2 or 3 week time horizon. It takes a while for people to feel that stuff. And this stuff is a lot of this stuff is going to have um, an impact, and that it's unquestionable that it will. We've seen, people feel it when there's a government shutdown. And a lot of what they're talking about now is basically doing a programmatic government shutdown or a voluntary one. One more point I want to make clear, because I think this is critical to this. Most of what they're doing in shutting down whole departments is illegal to start with. Maybe the Supreme Court's going to say it's fine. Who knows? But that is illegal to start with. We don't know how much of it they are going to be able to do. But at the same time, this is happening, you have the House Republicans, and particularly the Freedom Caucus, who want to do a budget that does all of these things. So all of these things are happening at the same time, and they're all kind of on a collision course. They're all coming together.
And, another piece moving here is that on Tuesday, the White House put out an executive order purporting to pull all the independent agencies in under Russ Vought's authority at OMB, and the White House. And it's the kind of thing that says you have to kind of run your rulemaking by these people before you do it, and you can be blocked by doing anything that doesn't kind of fit the political priorities of the administration. And I've been working on a kind of related story to this. So I've been talking to some people and asking them what they think. And it's interesting because to some degree, they think the EO is like pretty performative. It's like pretty theater because they're saying, look, are you really going to have like a rogue FTC right now acting contrarily to Trump's wishes, saying like, no, we're going to have this like progressive liberal mission. It's like, well, guess what? Then you're going to get fired and then your case is
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
work its way through the courts as well. So it's interesting because it's such like an explicit statement of this performance of the unitary executive, right? Which is there are no independent agencies, there are no civil service career folks. It's like everyone is partisan and everyone is an agent of the president directly. That is the theory, and it is interesting to see it kind of written out. But in terms of like the damage, this one seems to be more of a flourish than the kind of meat of it, which we expect to come out in whatever of these cases reaches the Supreme Court first, from, the fired NLRB member or one of these agencies who says, we've got Supreme Court precedent. I have for cause removal. That is it is really the key factor to keeping these agencies independent, right? Because what does a 5-year term or a 6-year term matter if you can be fired every time a new president takes over, right? Or that you need different members of different parties. Different commissions get around that all the time, right? It's like, okay, you have majority Republican, you have one Democrat, and you have one nominal independent, right? I mean, there are kind of ways to get around that, but it's really the for cause protections where you can only be fired for, you know, eh,
Misbehavior. Yeah.
malfeasance,
Real
neglect of
misbehavior.
duty.
Yeah.
It's not an at will thing. And that is the key. And that there's precedent, and people are all over the map about how they think the court's going to come out here. But like, that's the crux of it. This kind of like appointing Russ Vogt king of independent agencies, I'm sure like, has him like cackling and like rubbing his little hands together. But that's the meat.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you have found that, because that was certainly my impression. And as you also say, there's independent agencies and there's independent agencies. President comes in, the president puts in a chair of the FTC and the SEC and these kind of places. So the idea that the SEC is saying, whoa, you got elected president, but like, we got our own operation here. Back off, dude. That's not how it works. And we know that Biden had his people there. They made a lot of decisions. All of this stuff about, does it conform to the president's will and all this kind of stuff. That all sounds bad and is bad, but like, the president appoints the person. And like, he's not going to appoint someone who doesn't conform to what he wants. And that's just, and that's basic. We that is basically just obvious. These things follow. That's why people say elections have consequences, right? It follows it follows the presidency. Now, there's those kind of independent agencies, and then there are ones that act a little more like judges. And the NLRB is a case like that, where the NLRB is not a, in effect, it has policy making um, uh, capacity, but basically it's reviewing things, what's okay and what's and what's not. But the real issue here, the president makes policy on all of these things. Again, certainly for things like the FTC and SEC, those kinds of places. I think what it really the real game here is, does the presidency make policy when it comes to antitrust, right? Tight antitrust enforcement, or what we knew from, especially from Republican presidencies, and even to a significant extent Democratic presidencies, in the pre-Trump era, or is it like, for antitrust, I want you to go after these companies because they're my enemies. That is that's a different thing. And I suspect that is where, that's where the rubber really meets the road on these things. And that is something that isn't quite, there's nothing about that EO that touches that. On its face, it's just saying, you're going to be making policy and you need to make sure that it's in line with the president's views. And that's how it works to start with, right? Besides norms and like, oh, I didn't talk directly to the president and stuff. But I think we know that that is what this, that's what this really comes down to. The president has companies and people who he likes and who he does not like. And there's policy and there's going after enemies. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to get that's not going to be captured in EOs, because why would you capture it, right? So
So we're ending like for once on a note that's like, hey, maybe don't worry too much about this one, you know.
or the worry is coming from other directions. As you say, I think that's probably the best way to put it, as a flourish
Right.
that is kind of at most is adding a exclamation point to what they're just simply doing without any EOs. And let me just make one final point here. There is these independent agencies have, for half a century, you've had these independent agencies that even presidents who maybe in theory claim that presidents, laws can't be made that in any sense touch the actions of the president, but whatever, it's not bad having an SEC, so I'll go along with it. That is clearly you have a president now who wants to kind of try out those presidential powers and really do it, and clearly you have even the semi-normal conservatives on the Supreme Court are pretty bought into the idea that at the end of the day, president's the king of the executive branch, right? And maybe king in general. That's a whole other issue we'll get to in a different podcast, because that is not actually the system that was set up. And if you pretend to care about the ideas and intents of the people who wrote the federal constitution, that's not how it works. This isn't like Carl Schmitt's constitution, or some kind of quasi-Nazi who worked in who had a professorship at some German university in the 1920s and 30s. But that we will leave that for another edition of the podcast. Anything else we need to discuss?
Nope, I think we
Is that
covered
it?
it all.
All right. Talk to
All
you
right,
later.
see you next time. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.